Hello! I carried out an interesting experiment today with my Year 11 class. So I typed up the beginnings of 11 of their short stories that they'd written under exam conditions, and I got them to chop them out and lay them side by side, look at each pair, one on this page and one on that page, for 20 seconds and simply decide which was best. We kept doing that until we'd chosen a top three. And why I did this is I wanted to understand what teenagers who don't read books particularly rate in writing. And what was fascinating is that they didn't rate number 9 and number 11, both of which are the closest to an actual book. So in this video you're going to see perhaps the misconceptions you have about what makes good writing, and then learn how to change that. Okay, lesson number 1 comes from this student who got rejected because she didn't punctuate. It was a long shot inviting him to my party, but it was my 21st and in Hollywood, and not to brag, but I was well known. Scrap that, everyone knew me. Viper Room was the name of the club it was held at. So many famous people went there. The Johnny Depp owned it, but he wasn't there. What a shame. Happy birthday, they screamed, piercing my ears. I giggled and smiled awkwardly. And you can see by the way I'm reading, I'm not pausing because there aren't sentence ends. So I've rewritten this with the correct punctuation so that you can see what an effect this might have on a reader. With the punctuation, suddenly she now has a really distinctive voice. It was a long shot inviting him to my party, but it was my 21st and in Hollywood, and, not to brag, but I was well known. Scrap that. Everyone knew me. Viper Room was the club, celebrity filled. The Johnny Depp owned it, but he wasn't there. What a shame. Happy birthday, they screamed, piercing my ears. I giggled and smiled awkwardly. I know, weird, but I didn't know what to do. Immediately I remembered. River, sprinting over the security guards, demanding, "Has he come in?" I exhaled. So now I've got a kind of breathless, vain, excited narrator who I can relate to. And suddenly I'm really interested in this character. Now this writer, by contrast, is very descriptive and uses repetition very well. The air drew into my lungs as I regained consciousness. It was dark. I felt as though I was floating through space and time. I felt tranquil. Then it hit me. No one could prepare you for this. It was like I was on the moon without a helmet. The dark void trapped me. I was trapped. I kicked violently at the coffin. I had to stay calm. Crack! A small black lightning bolt lunged across the brown oak roof. A crumbling maroon soil seeped through. I screamed into the silence, shouted into the void. So I like this, but there are perhaps too many really short sentences like this one and this one, this one, this one and this one, and it overdoes the effect. The simile is also slightly imprecise. It was like I was on the moon without a helmet. Well, then you would die very quickly, but not through suffocation so much as the effect of air pressure. So it doesn't quite work, and you'd also die really quickly. But in this story, this person who's been buried in the coffin actually survives. Then we have some other descriptive elements. So the coffin is described with a brown oak roof, which is good description, but does not fit the idea of you being trapped underground in a coffin. You wouldn't know the colour, and actually you wouldn't care that it was oak unless you wanted to emphasise how strong it was. But here the writer doesn't want to emphasise the strength because look, the soil is going to come in, and then you've got this descriptive technique, lovely colour for the soil, maroon, but again in context you'd be in darkness, you wouldn't recognise the colour. So I've changed that to try and make it all more immediate. The air drew into my lungs as I regained consciousness. I was floating through space and time. I felt tranquil. Then it hit me. the dark void. I was trapped. I kicked violently at the coffin. I had to stay calm. Crack! A small lightning bolt lunged across the oak roof. Soil seeped through. I screamed into the silence, shouting into the void. So you can see here, I'm starting to move the writing away from these short staccato sentences to try and make the sentences longer and more varied. So once we've established the panic, we want to start making the description slower to give us time to think and the character time to think. Right, next I want to show you the two pieces that felt very much like books. This one happens almost accidentally, so let's take a look at it. I pulled my goggles down over my eyes to protect myself from the grain. Now, I love this because it starts straight away with the action and the reader has to catch up. What on earth is going on? Now, provided there are enough clues later on, that is a fabulous way to start a story. The reader is immediately drawn in and desperate to find out what's happening. Now here, we might expect the goggles to shield someone's eyes from rain, but this detail of the grain feels odd. Why would grain be in your eyes? So automatically, we're not in a setting that we understand. So potentially, this is a science fiction text where the universe doesn't behave exactly as we know it. It's not a planet that we entirely recognize. My black leather boots hit the ground and I felt sharp, jagged stones underfoot. One step closer to... So this is a planet and it feels a lot like our own now. A slight uphill. Having this kind of curtailed sentence brings the reader up short. It makes them pause and think, you know, why is this happening? It's a really good technique. With a bent knee, my legs sliced thin Algan air. Now, this is really interesting because when I pointed this out to my student, he said, "Oh, Mr. Salles, you didn't read Afghan properly." He hadn't spelled Afghan with an H and the L was an F. But you can see that because I had science fiction in my mind here, I simply assumed that this name was a made-up one for a made-up planet in a science fiction novel. And you'll see why the rest of it also fits that. This landing was not as hard as expected. I froze in the heat. So this is almost an oxymoron here, although he doesn't mean I was freezing in the heat, because that wouldn't make sense. It means I froze as in I didn't move. But it's a clever way to get the reader to pause and think, hang on, what's going on? And the more you do that, as long as there are clues for the reader to work it out, the better your writing is. Again, the curtailed sentence, a glimpse, like a silhouette in the middle of the day, an outline. And this mirroring of one sentence here, mirrored there after this one, works really well. It's a really interesting way to structure your writing. Again, powerful vocabulary here. So we're wondering, what on earth has he seen? Sand-covered death trap. Now, because we were actually wondering, it's really effective to have that as a single sentence paragraph. Although again, you can see he's cheating as a writer. There's no verb in this, so it's not a proper sentence. But it puts us on edge for that reason, and that matches the topic. He looks like he's in trouble. The weight of the mouse is the difference between heaven and earth. And that's beautiful phrasing there, and a great use of contrast. And really good writers focus on contrast all the time. We are also invited to imagine that the difference means between life and death. But it's quite subtle of him to label life earth and death heaven. So we have to infer that. It might not have noticed me. So here, the writer is actually trying to use personification of the landmine. So he's imagining a war setting in Afghanistan. The parachutist, presumably who's landed, has landed on a landmine and knows if they take their foot off, then they're going to die. However, because we now have a science fiction setting, it doesn't sound like this is a landmine. It sounds that there's some creature that the narrator realizes is underfoot that will pounce on him should he move. Again, we've got a really convincing science fiction setting. All right, it's happened by accident, but actually I hope you can see how this feels like a novel. And then we've got this very sophisticated personification. If my foot chooses to lift, I'm dead. Now that's a really brilliant kind of out-of-body experience. The stress of it is making him look at himself as though from above, trapped by myself in an open space. Again, the detail that he's in an open space suggests that perhaps he's being hunted, and that again gives credence to the idea that this is a creature and not a landmine. So ironically, this is a much better piece of writing as science fiction than it might have been as a simple war story, although even as a war story I hope you can see that it's pretty good. I desperately want to read on to find out what's going to happen next. So it won't surprise you to know that that piece was written by a boy, and often where boys fail is they include too many events and they don't include the character's feelings. I hope you can see how this writer has avoided that. He slows down time so that we focus on each individual moment and we get the character's thoughts, which then give us the character's feelings. So very good writing. Okay, well this one was written by a girl, and in many ways it's my favourite piece. But I'm going to tell you something quite interesting and really powerful. I showed this to our head of English, who's also an examiner, and she stopped reading once she got that far, and I'll tell you why. Sharp snapping twigs fill the empty silence around me, weaving systematically through the trees. So clearly, this is not a sentence, because although we have a verb, weaving, we don't have a subject doing the weaving. The subject is here. So that needs to be a comma. It has to be a comma. And because she hasn't put the comma in, the examiner has immediately dismissed the writer. And I can't overemphasize that enough. If you don't get your punctuation right, it will cost you immensely. Never mind what the mark scheme says. The examiner is only human, and they're passionate English teachers. So they will hate you if you don't punctuate. And I mean that seriously. They'll try and be professional, but they can't. It's not humanly possible. If you've got someone who's refusing to punctuate properly, you'll hate them a little bit because they are disrespecting the subject you love. So be warned about that. Anyway, let's imagine that was punctuated correctly. Weaving systematically through the trees. He turns around and my eyes focus on his badge, Nazi. So again, this one starts straight in with the action and we're trying to catch up. We infer from the badge that he's probably in uniform. Is he actually a Nazi soldier, or is she accusing him of being like a Nazi? This curtailed sentence again forces us to ask that question, so we're immediately engaged. His feet mimic my every step, and what a brilliant use of the word mimic. Instead of follow, he's copying her. It's not just that they're walking in time, there's an element of mockery here. We can feel that he is making fun of her and that she is his victim. And all that's achieved through this clever use of the word mimic. Now, we'll find out here that she is his hostage or victim, but we've already assumed that from the cunning use of this word. His hand is clasped to my arm and his other clutching to his gun. The use of to here is really unsettling. I couldn't work out whether it was just clumsy or if it's to make us feel unsettled given the situation that's developing here. And another thing that's unsettling is how, had we not had this implication that she's being held against her will, by this Nazi-style character, she's actually describing it like a love scene. His gaze never leaves mine, his hand is clasped to my arm. So that's quite subtle, isn't it? We understand that she's being held by force, but subtly she's describing him as like a lover. And that's going to be really important when we get down to this bit here. So she's deliberately laying the ground for a romantic encounter. My breathing hitches when he stops. So again, that could be an expression of fear, but in a different story open, it could be an expression of desire. And I really love the way this writer is playing with that idea, and you'll see why a little later on. Hitches is an extraordinary word for the breathing stopping. It's really, really powerful because it shows that element of stopping. It's got connotations of stitching, and we can kind of imagine the needle stopping here. But also we're familiar with the expression hitching up your skirt. And so there's an element of that allusion there makes us think slightly sexually of this situation. And again, she's preparing the ground for this attempted rape here. What are you going to do with me? I struggle a whisper. Now, this again is really powerful. Instead of I struggle to whisper, or I struggle in a whisper, which is what you'd normally expect, it's instead of fighting him, she's fighting against the whisper. And again, it suggests that she's going to give in to him. Ignoring my question, again, that's underlined because he pushes me back violently onto the tree is the sentence. So this should have a comma. And again, the examiner will turn against you. So here we've got a potential rape situation here. And this is a 16-year-old student or 15-year-old. And she's thinking, well, can I describe this? I grab his face and pull it closer to mine and kiss him. Now, this is a new paragraph and it is totally unexpected. We're expecting a rape scene here, but actually, she becomes sexually dominant, this character, and she takes control. And the writer emphasizes that with the one-word sentence, passionately. So it stops it being a sort of Mills and Boon kind of story, because we now find out why she's doing it. Forcing him onto the floor and climbing onto his lap. Ferociously, I unbutton his shirt. And here, she does need some kind of description of a sexual encounter, and it doesn't have to be explicit. She could just do it in a time lapse, so that we know sex has taken place, rather than she's just opened his shirt here. Then it's more convincing that he's lying on the floor because presumably he's satisfied or exhausted, or however you want to play it. And then we have this switch, like the pathetic man he is. And so this is a fantastic contrast, because here we've assumed some passion, but we've misunderstood the passion. The passion is not sexual desire. The passion is to incapacitate him so that she can take her revenge. His name is Alfred Zaffel, responsible for the murder of 16 Jews, although to the Führer he is nothing but a hero, to me a Saumensch. Now, this is really brilliant. She's given us all the backstory we need in just those words. So we know he's a real Nazi, we're in a Second World War setting, he's responsible for killing Jews. We can therefore infer, because of her outrage, that she is also Jewish. So we've inferred a hell of a lot here just from that simple detail. And a less skilled writer would have put this information right at the top up here and not started with the action. So I love this. Then we've got this obvious Yiddish or Hebrew sounding word here. I haven't looked up to see if it's real or not, because we just accept it in context. And again, that suggests that she's obviously Jewish. This is her own language she's speaking here. I kick the gun out of his reach and pace towards it. And so here we can now predict that she's going to pick up the gun and kill him, and we're more likely to believe that he doesn't get there before her if he's just had sex with her and his guard is down. So that again for me is very convincing, assuming that detail about sex having taken place was in it, and just like a novel. Really interesting vocabulary. I hope you can see why that is so good, and also why she'd lose marks for not punctuating. So, a reminder that my students didn't pick that because they're not thinking like experts. In fact, their favourite one was this one, number 10. My body feels numb, a dull ache pounds through my skull into the back of my head. Lifting my eyelids, they feel heavy, my mind is swamped like a misty fog, everything unclear. Then, wait, this can't be right. I should be dead. What's happening? Where am I? Panic floods through me. His blood was still in my system. So it is gripping, but what my students are gripped by is the questioning and the emotive language, and they love the emotion of it all. But the emotion's overdone. Whereas in this more novelistic approach, we can infer the emotion from the character's actions and this skillful use of vocabulary. It's much more subtle because the reader has to do much more work. In this one, the reader doesn't have to do any work other than work out what's happened. And by the time we get here, I shout every curse I can think of till I'm gasping for breath. The car, losing control, the bridge, water, Matt. I like that because we really do have to work out the chain of events. It's not explained, but there are enough clues for us to be very precise that the car's lost control, crossing a bridge and gone into the river probably. But the over-emotional beginning, which impressed my students, is not subtle, and the lack of subtlety stops you getting top marks. I hope you can see how this was subtle. Sorry, I was interrupted there. Yeah, I hope you can remember the subtlety of the description here, even though it was unintentional, that made it novelistic. So if you would like more, don't forget to subscribe. And if you'd like lots of in-depth help, don't forget to buy my guide, which is here. Interestingly, it's had 7 5-star reviews, but interestingly, students are buying it alongside Mr. Bruff's language guide in order to not only see which one is best, but they're obviously thinking, well, what's £3.99 and £3.99? That's only £8. I'd pay £30 for a tutor, so why don't I get both guides and learn everything I need to? That is quite interesting. I'm quite curious about that. So buy the guide, check it out, and get brilliant results. Cheaper than a tutor, what can I say?